Okay, we are beginning in chapter 10 of Echo. At first, Mike didn't know where he was. He sat up, blinking and staring into the bedroom until the events of yesterday came back to him. Next to him, Frankie rolled over, still sleeping. The clothes they'd worn when they arrived had been washed and folded and placed on a low bench at the end of the bed. Mike dressed and walked downstairs where all was still quiet. The double doors to the library were open. Mike stepped inside. It was dim and cave-like. Every window was covered with wooden shutters and closed tight. He studied the paneled walls, the fringed lampshades, and the large desk angled across a corner. His eyes drifted to the floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with books and the sliding ladder that stretched to the topmost shelves. A collection of metronomes sat on a small round table. A metronome is an instrument that keeps time while you're playing a musical instrument. Where was the piano? Retracing his steps, he crossed the entry hall to another set of double doors. He opened one and sucked in his breath. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating tiny specks of dust in the air. Potted palms appointed each corner. In the middle of the room sat the most magnificent instrument Mike had ever seen. A concert grand. It had to be 9 feet from keyboard to end. Once Granny had taken him to buy sheet music and the shop owner had a baby grand. He let Mike play it. The notes had seemed to leap from inside the instrument, the sound flying around the room. What power would an even larger piano hold? Mike ran his hands over the shiny ebony wood. He raised the lid and pulled the prop into place. For a few moments he gazed at the intricate insides, the tuning pins, the treble and bass strings, the soundboard and the hammers. Sliding onto the bench, he squeezed his hands into fists, released them, and spread his fingers wide. Hadn't Mr. Howard said the piano sorely needed playing? Hadn't they been chosen from bishops because they were musical? If Mrs. Sturbridge heard someone playing, maybe she'd be pleased. Was that one of the ifs and maybes? A music book stood on the stand. He flipped the pages until he came to the Chopin Nocturne No. 20. He positioned his hands, feeling the desire like a magnet drawing his fingertips closer. He played the opening chords. The room filled with the rich timbre of the piano and its full-bodied tone. It wasn't like any piano he'd heard before. The high notes sounded brighter, the low ones darker and more ominous. He began several times. At first, his phrasing was stilted, unpracticed. Then he felt himself descend into the music. He remembered Granny teaching him the piece when he was 9. When he finished the first pass, he heard her voice. Once more, but first I'm going to open the window so the entire neighborhood can hear you play. Mike succumbed to the melancholy notes, the insinuations of a march, the delicate filigree, and the final runs, slower and slower, until the final haunting note. He could almost sense Granny next to him on the piano bench and hear his mother humming. He was startled by a strange sound, a cross between a squeak and a gasp, and he looked up. Mrs. Sturbridge stood in the doorway, her hand on her heart, looking as if she'd seen a ghost. Before Mike could say a word, Mrs. Potter rushed into the room. "I'm sorry, missus, I didn't hear him come down." She took Mike's arm and led him to the kitchen. She sat him down at the table. "As much as your plan filled my heart, it pains me to say you must leave the piano be. It's never to be touched." Her eyes filled with regret. "It's a shame, beautiful instrument like that, just begging to be played. And to think of all the music that used to come from it." "I don't understand," said Mike. "Mr. Howard said—" Mrs. Potter held up a hand to interrupt. "Lots of things don't make sense around here. You'll get used to it. Now, go get your brother and come to the kitchen for breakfast. Mr. Howard will be over shortly to take you to town for new clothes." "Is she coming with us?" If so, Mike could apologize about the piano and explain how he and Frankie used to look cleaner and nicer. Mrs. Potter shook her head. "She has plans and won't be back till after dinner. and she's not inclined to being with you boys just yet. Go on now." Mike headed upstairs to retrieve Frankie. Why had she adopted them if she didn't want to be with them? How much more didn't make sense around here? Okay, now, your first question, because we are going to read another chapter today, but your first question is, how did Mrs. Sturbridge react to hearing Mike play the piano? So we don't see her doing much, but she is stopped, right? And then Mrs. Potter explains that he's not to do that again. Okay. All right, chapter 11. Mike held Frankie's hand as they hurried after Mr. Howard, who walked down Amaryllis Drive with brisk purpose, whistling all the while. Striding past, he pointed out his house on the corner. 2 enormous elms grew on either side of the center walkway, the branches almost touching in the middle. "It's the same age and style as Mrs. Sturbridge's, but I've had it all remodeled." He pulled his watch from his pocket. "Come on, boys, if we cut through the park and hurry, we can catch the next trolley." Mike took longer strides to keep up. 2 blocks down, Mr. Howard pointed to the park square where a gazebo sat in the center. They dashed through to the boulevard on the other side, just in time to catch the approaching trolley. Within a few stops, the houses changed from older, stately homes to more modest bungalows. Mile by mile, the buildings grew taller. When the trolley rattled to a stop in the bustle of downtown Philadelphia, they stepped off. Even though it was hotter and more humid here within the narrow streets where a breeze couldn't find its way, Mike felt more at home. It reminded him of Granny's neighborhood. Walk-up apartments, girls jumping rope across the sidewalk, boys playing pickleball in the street, cars and trunks honking. He looked up, hoping to see a window with a hand-printed sign for piano lessons, knowing full well he wasn't anywhere near where he used to live. When Mr. Howard led them through the revolving doors of Highlander's department store, the noise fell away. Inside, everything was shined and polished. The glass cases, the merchandise, the faces of the salesmen and salesladies, even the air smelled expensive. All the customers wore what looked like their Sunday best. Mike ran his hands over his clothes, feeling all wrong. "Boys, go on up to the 3rd floor, the young gentlemen's department," said Mr. Howard. "I'll meet you there. I need to take care of Mrs. Sturbridge's account in the office first." Mike and Frankie slowly walked between cases topped with gloves and scarves, umbrellas, wallets, hats, and perfumery. Frankie stopped to gawk at a display of glass figurines. A saleslady rushed forward and frowned. Mike pulled Frankie toward the elevator. "3rd floor," he told the elevator operator. The man looked at them and sniffed. He swept his fingers over the lapels of his blue suit as if brushing away dirt. "Boys, you cannot run around ripshod through this establishment." "We weren't running," said Frankie. "Do you plan on purchasing something?" asked the man. "Yes, sir," said Mike, "in the young gentleman's department." The man's eyes inspected them. He signaled to a salesman who hurried over. The 2 men whispered. "Okay, what do you think's going on here? Why are they being treated so rudely? They're not dressed nicely, are they? And at this time, when you went to stores, you went in your very best, and it was not just a place you kind of went to just hang out. They were afraid they were. Remember, this is in the 30s, too. This is the Depression. They didn't want, they were snooty. They didn't want poor people just hanging around." Mike heard only bits of what they said. No money, one thing in mind, little thieves. Mike felt his face grow hot and knew it was reddening. The salesman signaled to several nearby clerks, then grabbed Frankie's arm. "Boys, let me escort you back outside. I think you are in the wrong place." Frankie jerked his arm away and clung to Mike. "Leave us alone." The clerks hurried forward and spread their arms wide, surrounding them. The salesman grabbed the neck of Mike's shirt and twisted his right arm behind his back, marching him toward the door. Mike panicked. "Let me go! What are you doing?" He hadn't ever been manhandled like this before. He tried to wriggle from the man's grip. The salesman tightened his hold and whispered in his ear, "Find another store to pilfer." Pilfer is another word for to rob from. Frankie began to scream, "Stop! Stop!" He lunged forward, pounding the man with his fist. "Call the police!" yelled the elevator operator. Mr. Howard's voice boomed. "Take your hands off those boys and step aside, or I'll call the authorities, and I don't mean the police. I mean Mr. Highlander himself." The salesman released Mike and backed away. Mike's entire body shook. Tears stung his eyes. They had thought they were thieves? He'd never stolen a thing in his life. Mr. Howard strode closer and put an arm around each of them. "You boys okay?" "They wanted us to leave. They wanted to take Mike away," whimpered Frankie, "for no reason." "We'll see about that." Mr. Howard looked at one of the salesmen. "Call the store manager at once." Mr. Howard sat in an overstuffed chair in the young gentleman's department with Frankie on his lap and Mike at his side. "My apologies, Mr. Howard," said the store manager, a short man with a skinny mustache. He paced in front of them. "It was a misunderstanding. We had no way of knowing these boys were with you." Mr. Howard raised his eyebrows. "As I recall, over the years, my client, Mrs. Sturbridge, has spent a fair amount of money in this store and in this very department." "Oh, yes, sir, she has indeed." "These boys are her wards," said Mr. Howard. "They are clean and polite. They're poorly dressed, yes, but does that make them shoplifters? No, it makes them in need of new clothes, which is why we're here. There's something very wrong about how they were treated, sir, when they were doing exactly what I told them. Do you think I need to mention this to Mr. Highlander?" "Oh, no, Mr. Howard," stammered the store manager. He snapped his fingers and a young salesman stepped forward. "Charles will assist you. No reason ever to mention it again, and you can be sure I'll talk to the employees. I'll call a special meeting. Count on it." "Fine, then," said Mr. Howard. "I need a wardrobe for each of these young gentlemen. 4 shirts, 3 pair of trousers, stockings, romper togs for unders, suspenders, and a cap, wool or felt. Make one of the pants and shirts for dress, and throw in a vest and tie for each. Oh, and we'd better have shoes." He looked at their feet. 2 pair. Brown lace-up leathers for every day and black Oxfords for dress. Frankie grinned at Mike. Mike couldn't smile back. The embarrassment still smarted, and his face still pulsed from the humiliation. He looked down as Charles ushered them into a dressing room. Had Mrs. Sturbridge thought the same when she first saw them? Had she wondered if they were little thieves, too? "I'll be sitting right here, boys, reading the paper," said Mr. Howard. "When you're ready, come out and show me your outfits." Behind the curtain, Mike relaxed. He and Frankie spent an hour trying on clothes and darting back and forth to Mr. Howard for approval. When they were alone in the dressing room, they made goofy faces at each other in the mirror. Once fitted, they followed Mr. Howard, now laden with parcels, means bags of what they bought, outside to the front of Highlanders. "Thank you, Mr. Howard," said Mike, "for bringing us. We never had so much new or nice at one time, and thank you for standing up for us, too." Mr. Howard smiled. "You have just as much right to be in that store as the next person, so you're welcome. But it's Eunie you should thank for your clothes. She's your benefactor." Mike nodded. "I will, sir, first chance I get." "Eunie?" Frankie crinkled his nose. "Her given name is Eunice," said Mr. Howard. "I started calling her Eunie when we were children." "What should we call her?" asked Frankie. "She didn't like it when I asked if she was going to be our mother." "No, well, let's give her some time," said Mr. Howard. "For now, just Ma'am or Mrs. Sturbridge will do." As they headed down the street, Mike couldn't stop peeking at himself in store windows. Was it really him? He didn't look at all like something dragged from the gutter. He looked smart and new, as if he belonged with Mr. Howard. Would Mrs. Sturbridge or Ma'am or whatever they agreed to call her agree? Okay. So, isn't it interesting how your appearance really does matter? How we have that phrase to not judge a book by its cover. But are there times when people do judge you by what you look like or how you act? And it wasn't how they were acting fine. It was simply on the way they looked. that they were basically attacked, right? And they were going to throw him out of the store had Mr. Howard not been there. If it were you, would you have wanted to stay there and get clothes? I think if I were Mr. Howard, I think I would have gone somewhere else. I wouldn't have wanted to give them the business. The problem in that time, though, was there might not have been a lot of other places to go. There might have been limited opportunities, so you couldn't just kind of take your business somewhere else. Okay, so the next question is talking about why were the boys treated badly when they went shopping for clothes. So don't tell me what happened, just tell me why they were treated badly, which is exactly what we just talked about. And then in the comments below, I want you to give me your thoughts about why the piano, if we know Mrs. Sturbridge is an accomplished, a good pianist, and they wanted someone who could play the piano, and Mr. Howard said it sorely needed playing, why do they not want them playing the piano? Give me your ideas. You should be able to have a few ideas on this. Why? What could make someone who is good and has a beautiful piano not want it played? So, do some predicting, do some thinking. As you read, your mind should always be asking questions. You should always be trying to guess the next thing. That's what good readers do. Okay, have a good day.